morning Vera Calloway walked into the livestock auction in Harlan Creek. She was carrying a carpetbag that had seen better decades, and wearing a dress that had been let out twice and taken in once, which told the whole story of the last few years, if you knew how to read a hemline. She set the bag down at her feet, reached into the pocket of her coat, and placed her wedding ring on the auctioneer's table, without ceremony, without explanation, and without looking at the man behind it longer than was necessary. She said she wanted 3 goats for it, good milkers if he had them. The auctioneer, whose name was Pruitt and who had never in 22 years of selling livestock been offered a gold ring in lieu of currency, looked at it the way a man looks at something he suspects is going to cause him trouble. He picked it up, held it to the light. The ring was plain, narrow, the kind a man buys when he means to do right by a woman, but does not have much to work with. There was a small engraving on the inside. He did not read it aloud, which was the only decent thing he did that morning. The problem was that the auction house was not empty. It was a Thursday, which was sale day, and half of Harlan Creek had come through those doors by 9 in the morning. There were ranchers and their hands leaning against the fence rails. There were women from town who had come to buy laying hens and stayed because the air inside was warmer than outside, and the cold that October had come down off the ridge early and mean. There was a cluster of men near the far gate who had been talking about cattle prices and had stopped talking about cattle prices. Everyone saw. Vera did not look at any of them. Her chin was level in the way of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart, who made that decision somewhere private and well before she arrived, and who intends to honor it regardless of what the room does around her. She was 31 years old. She had gray beginning at her left temple, a single streak of it, which on another woman in another life might have looked distinguished. On her it just looked like evidence. Pruitt set the ring down and said he couldn't take jewelry. Auction house rules, he said, though there were no such rules and everyone present knew it. She said she understood, picked the ring back up and asked if he knew anyone who might be selling 3 milking goats for a fair price or for work, because she had both to offer. He did not answer her. She picked up her carpetbag, settled it in the crook of her elbow, and walked toward the door. The crowd parted for her the way crowds part for things they are not sure how to look at directly. A woman near the hen crates said something to the woman beside her, and the woman beside her made a sound of agreement, and neither of them said it loud enough to be called out for it, but loud enough to be heard. Vera heard it. She pushed through the door and stood on the plank walkway outside in the cold, and the wind came down the main street of Harlan Creek and found her immediately, the way wind does when you are standing still and alone. By the second spring, people would stop calling the Aldrich place the loneliest farm in the county. She didn't know that yet. She had been standing there perhaps 3 minutes when the door opened behind her and a man came out. He was tall in the way that comes from work rather than inheritance, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been used hard for a long time and had simply accepted that as the terms. He wore a coat that had been good once and was still serviceable, and his hat was pulled low against the wind. He stopped beside her on the walkway, not close, and looked out at the street. He said, without looking at her, that he had 3 goats. She looked at him. He said they were good milkers, all of them, and that he had a 4th that was not a milker, but was useful in other ways. He said he had been meaning to reduce the herd for a while, and had not gotten around to it. She said, "What would you want for them?" He said he had a problem that was more pressing than what he wanted for the goats. He said his name was Cal Aldrich, that he ran a cattle operation about 4 miles northeast of town, that his housekeeper of 6 years had left in September to go live with her daughter in Tulsa, and that he had 2 children, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6, who had been eating his cooking since then, which he said was not a kindness to anyone. He said, "Can you cook?" She said she could, and that she was not afraid of hard work. He looked at her then, directly, for the first time. He had dark eyes that did not give much away, which was either a habit or a character, and at that point, it was too early to know which. He said the work would be room and board, and a wage, that it was honest work, and temporary if she wanted it that way, and that the goats would be hers regardless, since he had been meaning to move them on, and she had need of them. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them. She said, "All right." He said, "All right," and picked up her carpetbag before she could reach for it, not as a gesture of romance, but with the same practical efficiency with which he might pick up a fence post or a feed sack, because it was there and needed carrying, and he was going in that direction. His wagon was at the end of the street. She walked beside him. The women by the hen crates had come to the window and were watching. She knew this without looking. She had learned some time ago that being watched was simply a condition of being a woman in a small town, like weather or mud season. You did not have to like it. You only had to keep walking. Her name was Vera Calloway, though it would not be Calloway much longer, in one direction or another. She had come to Harlan Creek 8 months prior from a town called Milo, 60 miles east, where she had been married for 4 years to a man named Douglas Calloway, who had borrowed against the land she had inherited from her aunt without telling her, lost it, and then left for somewhere west without leaving a forwarding address or an explanation. Only a debt that had her name on it, because she had signed where he told her to sign, without reading carefully enough. She had paid what she could pay, sold what she could sell, and arrived in Harlan Creek with the carpetbag and the ring and the particular kind of exhaustion that is not tiredness, but the aftermath of a long, sustained effort to survive something that should not have happened to you. Before Milo there had been the Greer County Orphanage, where she had lived from the age of 7 to the age of 17, which had taught her to cook for large numbers of people, to keep accounts, to work without being thanked for it, and to hold her face still when she needed to. She did not talk about the orphanage. It was simply the ground she had grown up from, like a tree does not discuss the soil. She had no people. She had a carpetbag, a wedding ring she had just tried to trade for livestock, and, as of this morning, a temporary position on a cattle ranch 4 miles northeast of town. She had had less. Cal Aldrich's place sat at the base of a long ridge, the kind of land that looked like it had been put there by someone who meant business. The house was 2 stories, timber-framed, with a porch that wrapped around the front and one side. It had been built by a man who planned to stay, and it looked like it. The barn was larger than the house, which told you what the priorities were. There were 3 outbuildings, a root cellar, a kitchen garden that had been let go since September and showed it, and a long fence line that ran east until it disappeared into the tree line. 2 children were standing on the porch when the wagon came up the drive. The boy, whose name was Emmett, was 9 years old and had his father's eyes and a mouth set in a line that suggested he had formed opinions about this situation already, and they were not favorable. He stood with his arms crossed, which on a 9-year-old is both serious and slightly heartbreaking. The girl was 6 and her name was June, and she had red hair that had not been properly brushed in some time, and she was holding a cat that was clearly not interested in being held. She looked at Vera with the frank, unguarded assessment that 6-year-olds are still capable of before the world teaches them to be more careful about it. June said, "Are you going to stay?" Cal said, "She's going to help out for a while." June said, "Good, because Papa burned the beans again, and I think it's getting worse." The corner of Cal Aldrich's mouth moved once and returned to where it had been. Vera looked at the kitchen garden. She looked at the porch. She looked at the 2 children and the unimpressed cat and the man standing beside her, who was already reaching for her carpetbag again. She said, "Burnt beans are a serious matter. I don't take them lightly." June nodded as if this were the correct and only acceptable answer. Emmett said nothing and went inside. The kitchen was large and had good bones, and had been in a state of managed emergency since September. There were dishes stacked in a way that indicated good intentions, followed by discouragement. The larder was low but not bare. There was a cast-iron stove that was excellent, the best thing in the room, and Vera recognized it the way you recognize something that has been waiting for someone who knows what to do with it. She put her carpetbag down by the door to the back room that Cal showed her, which was small and had a window that faced east and a bed with a quilt on it that had been folded by someone who cared about folding. She did not unpack. Not yet. She went back to the kitchen and started supper. She made what the larder allowed, which was a bean soup with salt pork and cornbread, and she made it well, because she had been cooking since she was 8 years old and had never had the luxury of making it poorly. By the time Cal came in from the evening chores, the kitchen was warm and smelled of something that had been tended to. And Emmett, who had been sitting at the table with a book and pretending not to notice anything, had moved his book 3 inches toward the stove without appearing to realize he had done it. June said, "This is better." Cal looked at the table and then at Vera and said, "It is." That was all. Supper was eaten mostly in quiet. The kind of quiet that is not uncomfortable, but is simply the natural state of people who are still figuring out what they are to each other. Vera washed the dishes. Cal went back out to check on the stock. Emmett took his book to his room. June fell asleep in the chair by the stove with the cat on her lap. And Vera left her there a while before carrying her up to bed, because she weighed almost nothing and it was no trouble. And because there is a kind of peace in a sleeping child that it seems wrong to interrupt too soon. She went to her room. She did not unpack the carpetbag, but she set it in the corner rather than by the door. That was the difference, and she was the only one who noticed it. The first week passed in the way that first weeks do when you are learning a place. She learned the stove's moods, which were considerable. She learned that Emmett liked his eggs cooked through, and June liked hers soft, and that Cal drank his coffee black and had it before dawn, which meant she began rising before dawn to have it ready, not because he asked her to, but because it was her job, and she took her job seriously. She learned that the root cellar had more in it than the kitchen suggested, that someone, probably the previous housekeeper, had put up a substantial quantity of preserves and dried goods that only needed to be found and used. She found them and used them. She learned that Cal Aldrich was a man of very few unnecessary words. He said what needed saying and not what didn't. When something was wrong, he said so plainly, without heat. When something was right, he said so in the same tone, which meant both carried equal weight. He said on the 4th morning that she had found the preserves. She said she had. He said Mrs. Hennessy, the previous housekeeper, had put those up over 3 summers, and he had forgotten they were there. Vera said it would be a shame to let them go. He said yes and drank his coffee and went out. That was the whole of it. But something in the plainness of it settled something in her that had not been settled in a long time. The goats arrived at the end of the first week. Cal brought them himself. 3 brown and white does with the calm, slightly judgmental expressions that goats tend to wear, as if they have assessed your situation and found it adequate but not remarkable. He put them in the small pen beside the barn and showed her where the feed was kept without being asked to. She thanked him. He said they were good milkers, as he had said. He said the one with the notched ear was the best of the 3. She said she would remember that. He nodded and went back to the barn. She stood with the goats a moment, her hand on the fence rail, looking at them in the thin October light. They were hers, not borrowed, not contingent on anything, not subject to anyone else's decisions or debts. 3 goats with calm eyes and notched ears and milk that would be hers to use or sell as she saw fit. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. Emmett thawed the way ice does in early spring, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the gradual and almost imperceptible way that one morning you notice the ground is softer than it was. He began appearing in the kitchen in the evenings, ostensibly for other reasons. A glass of water, a forgotten book, something he needed from the larder, He would stay, briefly, and then slightly less briefly. He watched her work with the focused attention of a child who is learning something and does not want to admit he is learning it. On the 10th day he said, "How do you know when the bread is ready?" She showed him. She had him press his knuckle to the crust and feel for the hollow sound. He did it with great seriousness. He said, "Oh," she said, "now you know." He said nothing, but the next morning he was in the kitchen before June, which had not happened before. The kitchen garden she began clearing in the second week, pulling the dead growth and turning the soil in the rows that could still be worked before the hard freeze came. It was cold work, the ground stiff and resistant, and she did it in the mornings after breakfast was cleared, working steadily and without complaint. Cal saw her at it one morning from the fence line and said nothing. But the following morning, there was a better spade leaning against the garden gate that had not been there the day before. Nothing was said about the spade. She said nothing about it either. She began to understand that this was how he communicated, not in words, but in the placement of things. A better spade. A second lamp appeared in her room without explanation. A loose board on the back step that she had been stepping around was repaired one afternoon while she was in town with June picking up flour and salt, and when she came back and stepped on it and found it solid, she simply adjusted her step and went inside and started supper. These were not romantic gestures, or they were not only romantic gestures, they were the actions of a man who noticed what needed doing and did it, and who had perhaps noticed, specifically, what she needed done. She noticed that he noticed. She said nothing about it. Neither did he. November settled in with purpose. The cold came down off the ridge and stayed, and the mornings turned the kind of dark that makes the lamplight inside a house feel like something worth having. Vera kept the kitchen warm. She kept the larder organized and the meals regular and the children fed and the accounts, which Cal had shown her with some embarrassment, in a state of better order. She had a head for numbers, another thing the orphanage had given her that she had not asked for and had learned to be grateful for anyway. The town of Harlan Creek, which had watched her walk out of the auction house on the arm of Cal Aldrich's practical offer, had opinions about this arrangement, and those opinions were not uniformly charitable. Word travels in a small town the way weather does, low and fast and ahead of itself. By the second week of November, most of Harlan Creek knew that the Calloway woman, the one who had tried to trade her wedding ring for goats, was living out at the Aldrich place in what the more generous residents called a housekeeping arrangement, and what the less generous ones called something else. The less generous ones were led, in the informal way these things are led, by a woman named Dora Fitch, who ran the dry goods store with her husband, and had a voice built for distance and a concern that she prepared at home before bringing it out in public. Dora Fitch had known Cal Aldrich for 15 years and had opinions about who was and was not suitable for his household, and she expressed these opinions in the form of questions, which is the most durable form of accusation, because it is the hardest to defend against. She asked in the dry goods store one Saturday morning in November, within earshot of 4 other women, whether anyone knew much about the Calloway woman's people. She said she only asked because of the children, naturally. She said she had heard things from Milo about a husband, about debts, about circumstances that a person might wonder about. Vera was in the store. She had come for thread and a bolt of cotton flannel, because June's winter coat needed letting out, and Emmett had worn through the elbows of both his good shirts. She was standing 6 feet from Dora Fitch when Dora Fitch said this, and Dora Fitch knew she was standing there. Vera set her thread on the counter. She paid for it. She picked up the flannel. She said good morning to the woman behind the counter and walked out. Her face did what she needed it to do. It had a great deal of practice. December came, and with it the kind of cold that makes the world very simple and very quiet. The cattle needed more tending. The water troughs needed breaking twice a day. The wood supply needed managing carefully, and Cal was out before light and back after dark most days, coming in with the cold still on him, sitting down to whatever Vera had kept warm on the back of the stove. She had taken to leaving a plate covered on the warming shelf for him on the nights he came in late. She did not wait up. She went to bed at a reasonable hour. But the plate was there, and the coffee was in the pot, and the stove was banked in a way that it would hold heat until he came in. He never commented on this. She never mentioned it. But one morning, she came downstairs before dawn and found that he had, at some point in the night, brought in an extra load of wood and stacked it beside the kitchen stove, enough for 3 days of hard burning, and set it so carefully that it had not made any noise. She stood in the kitchen in the dark, looking at the wood for a moment. Then she started the coffee. It was June who detonated the midpoint, as children do, without any awareness of the weight of what she was saying, which is precisely what gives it its weight. It was a Sunday in mid-December, one of those rare winter Sundays, when the cold had eased just enough that the light through the kitchen windows was almost warm, and Vera had made a proper breakfast, biscuits and gravy and eggs, the kind of breakfast that takes time and fills a house with a smell that feels like a promise kept. Cal was at the table with his coffee. Emmett was eating with the focused attention he gave to things he approved of but was not ready to endorse openly. June was beside Vera at the stove, watching the gravy with the gravity of a 6-year-old who has been told this is an important process. Vera showed her how to stir it, slow and even, and June did it with great concentration, her tongue between her teeth. Then June looked up at her, with the direct, unguarded eyes of a child who has not yet learned to bury the true thing, and said, "Mama, is it thick enough?" The kitchen went very still, not the bad kind of still, the kind that happens when something true has been said in a room, and the room is deciding what to do with it. June had not noticed what she said. She was looking at the gravy. Vera looked at the gravy too. She said, "A little longer. Keep stirring." June kept stirring. Vera did not look at Cal. She did not need to. She could feel him across the kitchen the way you can feel a change in the weather before it arrives, a shift in the pressure of the air, a new quality to the light. She knew without looking that he had gone still, that he was holding his coffee cup and not drinking from it, that something had moved across his face that he was setting aside to deal with later. She set aside her own version of the same thing. But it had been said. It was in the room now, the way something is in a room once it has been said, regardless of whether anyone acknowledges it. It changes the air. It changes what is possible. She served the breakfast. They ate it. Emmett said it was good. Cal said it was very good. June said the gravy was the best part, and that she had made it, which was not entirely accurate, but was not entirely inaccurate either. That afternoon, Vera went to check on the goats and stood in the cold of the small pen for longer than the goats required, her hand on the notched ear of the best milker, looking at the ridge to the north where the sky was going. The color of pewter and the first suggestion of new snow was moving in the high air. She was not a woman who let herself want things carelessly. She had learned the cost of that. But she was also not a woman who could lie to herself indefinitely, and she was honest enough, standing in that pen in December, to acknowledge that something had shifted in her that she could not shift back, and that the life inside that house, the warmth of it, the specific weight of June asleep against her shoulder on the evening she read to them, the sound of Emmett's questions in the kitchen, the particular quality of Cal Aldrich's silence, which was not empty but full, the way a held breath is full, that this life had become something she would grieve if it ended. She had not meant to let that happen. She had been so careful. She went back inside and started supper. Douglas Calloway arrived on the second Thursday of January. He came into town first, which was how Vera learned about it, because Harlan Creek was the kind of town that sent word ahead of itself. It was Mrs. Alderman from the post office who told her, on a Wednesday afternoon when Vera had come in for the mail, that a man had been asking after a Vera Calloway, A man who said he was her husband, who had the look of someone who had been west and not found what he was looking for there. Vera stood at the post office counter and received this information with a face that did what she needed it to do. She thanked Mrs. Alderman and went home. She told Cal that evening, after the children were in bed. She told him plainly, the way she told him most things, without embellishment or appeal. She told him that Douglas Calloway was in town, that he was her husband in the legal sense, that there had been a debt and a land claim, and that she did not know what he wanted, but that she thought she should tell him. Cal listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" She said she did not know yet. He said, "All right," and that was all he said. But he sat at the kitchen table a while longer than he usually did, turning his coffee cup in his hands, and she understood that he was thinking, and that what he was thinking about was not only logistics. Douglas came to the ranch on Thursday afternoon, which she had known he would. He was thinner than she remembered, and there was a quality to him now, a watchfulness that had not been there before, or that she had not seen before, which was not the same thing. He stood on the porch and spoke to her through the door for a moment before she opened it, which told her something about the state of his confidence. He said he had come to talk. He said he had a proposition. She let him in because it was cold and because she was not afraid of him, only tired of him, which is a different thing entirely. He sat at her kitchen table and told her that there was a parcel of land adjacent to what had been her aunt's land in Milo that he had an option on, and that if she would come back and sign as his wife, the option would convert to a deed, and they could start again. He said he had made mistakes. He said he knew that. He said he was willing to make it right. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Douglas, you borrowed against land that was mine without telling me. You signed my name to a debt I didn't know about. You left without a word and without leaving anything behind, not an address, not an explanation, not a dollar, and now you're here because you need my signature." He said it wasn't like that. She said, "I know what it was like. I lived it." He said she was being unreasonable. She said she did not think she was. He stayed another 20 minutes, cycling through several versions of the same argument, and she listened to each version with the patience of a woman who has a great deal of practice waiting for a thing to be over. When he had finished, she said she would need time to consult with a lawyer about the legal standing of the marriage and the debt, and that she would not be signing anything without understanding what she was signing. He left unhappy, which she had expected. What she had not expected was that he would go directly from the ranch to Dora Fitch's dry goods store, which was also the closest thing Harlan Creek had to a public forum, and tell his version of things to whoever was willing to listen. His version featured a wife who had abandoned a marriage, who was living in a compromised situation on another man's property, who had refused a genuine offer of reconciliation. Dora Fitch found this version entirely credible and extremely useful. By the following morning it was through the town. Cal heard it at the feed store on Friday. He came home and said nothing about it at supper, but she could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his quiet, which was different from his usual quiet, the way a sky before a storm is different from an ordinary sky. After supper, after the children were in bed, he said, "I heard what he's saying in town." She said, "I expected he would say something." Cal said, "It's not true." She said, "No." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to the hardware store meeting tomorrow, the one about the road assessment. Half the town will be there." She said she knew about the meeting. He said, "I'd like you to come." She looked at him. He said, "If you're willing." She said she was willing. The road assessment meeting was held in the back room of the hardware store on Saturday morning, which was the largest interior space in Harlan Creek that was not a church. And it was full. It was full in the way that small-town meetings are full when there is something in the air beyond the stated agenda. When people have come not only for the road assessment, but for whatever else might happen, because word had traveled, as it does, low and fast. Douglas Calloway was there. Dora Fitch was there, seated near the front with the posture of a woman who has prepared remarks. Vera came in with Cal and stood beside him near the wall, and she felt the room adjust to their entrance the way a room does when it is watching something it has already formed opinions about. The road assessment was discussed. It took about 20 minutes. Then, in the way these things go, the actual business of the gathering made itself known. Douglas stood up and said, in the reasonable tone of a man who has practiced reasonableness, that he was concerned about a private matter that had become a public one, and that he only raised it because the community's good name was involved. He said his wife, meaning Vera, had left a legal marriage and taken up residence in a situation that he thought the community would want to be aware of. The room was very quiet. Cal Aldrich, who had not moved from the wall, said, "That's not accurate." His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. He said, "Vera Calloway came to work on my property as a housekeeper, in a position that is paid, documented, and above any reproach. He said she has conducted herself with more dignity and more competence than anyone I have ever employed. And I have employed a number of people, over 15 years. He said, as for her marriage, I understand there's a legal question about a debt that was incurred in her name without her knowledge. And I have asked a lawyer in Colfax to look at the papers, because that is the kind of thing a person ought to have looked at. Douglas said, she's still my wife. Cal said, that may be, but she's not your property. And what you've been saying in this town about her is not accurate, and I'd like it to stop. He said it the way he said most things. Plain, without heat, with the particular authority of a man who has decided he is going to say a thing and is not interested in whether it is convenient. Douglas looked around the room for support and found that the room was not offering it. Dora Fitch had the expression of a woman who is recalibrating. The men along the far wall were looking at the floor or the ceiling in the way men do when they have decided a thing is settled. Douglas said something else, shorter, and then sat down. The meeting ended shortly after. People filed out. Several of them, on the way past, said good morning to Vera in the tone of people who are correcting a prior omission. Mrs. Alderman from the post office stopped and said she hoped the goats were settling in well. A man named Garrett, who ran the livery, said to Cal that he'd heard the road assessment was going to go through the north section, and they talked about it for a moment, which was its own kind of statement. Dora Fitch left without speaking to anyone, which was, for Dora Fitch, as close to an apology as such a person gives. Douglas Calloway left Harlan Creek the following Monday. He did not say goodbye. He did not leave a forwarding address. He had a talent for departures, at least. That much had not changed. The lawyer in Colfax sent papers in February. The debt, as it turned out, had been fraudulently assigned, and the signature on the original document was not entirely Vera's. It was the kind of thing that takes time to untangle, but that can be untangled, given a patient lawyer and proper documentation, and Cal had provided both. She did not ask him how much it cost. He did not tell her. She suspected she would find out eventually, and that it would matter, and that she would find a way to address it, because she did not accept gifts she could not account for. It was a Saturday evening in late February, the kind of evening that is still cold but has a different quality to the cold, a looseness in it, as if the cold knows its time is shortening. The children were in bed. Vera was at the kitchen table with the accounts, which she had brought into a state of order that Cal had once described as remarkable, though remarkable was not a word he used often. The lamp was burning. The stove was warm. Cal came in from the barn later than usual, stomped the mud from his boots, and poured himself coffee. He stood at the counter a moment. Then he sat down across from her at the table. He said, I want to ask you something. She set down her pencil. He said, I've been thinking about how to say this, and I don't think there's a better way than plain. so I'm going to say it plain. She waited. He said, I would like you to stay, not as a housekeeper, permanently, as my wife, if that's what you'd want. He said he knew she had just come through something that had given her good reason to be careful about that word and what it meant, and that he was not asking her to decide tonight or this week or even this month. He said he wanted her to know that whatever she decided, the goats were hers and the wage was hers, and her room was hers for as long as she needed it, and that none of that was contingent on her answer. He said, I'm not a man who says things easily, but I want you to know that the life in this house, since you came into it, is better. Not just the meals, though the meals are considerably better. He said, you are a person worth knowing, Vera. I have known that since October. I should have said it before now. He stopped. The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had died down, and the night was very still, the way February nights get when the cold is thinking about loosening its grip. She looked at him across the table. She looked at his hands around the coffee cup, the hands that had carried her bag and fixed the step and stacked the wood in the dark without waking her. She thought about the spade at the garden gate. She thought about June's voice saying "Mama" over the gravy pot, and the way the word had landed in the room like a stone in still water, the rings of it still moving. She had not let herself want things carelessly. She had been so careful. She said, yes. He looked at her. She said, that's what I want. He was quiet for a moment, the way a man is quiet when something he has been carrying for a long time has been set down and he is still adjusting to the absence of the weight. Then he said, all right. She said, all right. She picked up her pencil. He drank his coffee. The lamp burned between them, and the stove held its warmth, and outside the February night was still and cold and beginning, very slightly, to think about spring. They were married in March, on a Thursday at the county clerk's office in Colfax, with Emmett and June as witnesses, which June accepted as a position of great importance, and Emmett accepted with a dignity that was almost entirely successful. The clerk said the words. Cal said his plainly and completely. Vera said hers the same way. On the drive home, June fell asleep against Vera's arm before they had gone 2 miles, and Emmett sat on the other side of the wagon and looked at the road ahead, and said, after a while, that he supposed this was all right. Cal said he supposed it was. Emmett said nothing else, but he moved slightly closer to his father's side on the bench, which was its own kind of statement. And Cal put one hand briefly on the boy's shoulder and left it there for a moment, before the road required both hands again. By the time the frost had fully left the ground in April, the kitchen garden was turned and planted. Vera had put in twice what the previous garden had held, working the beds in the early mornings while the light was still thin, and the air still had the last of the winter in it. The goats were producing well, all 3 of them, and the one with the notched ear was the best milker, as Cal had said she would be. There was enough milk now that Vera had begun making cheese, which she sold on Saturdays at the market in town, and which had developed a reputation in Harlan Creek that was entirely separate from any other reputation she might once have had. The carpetbag was in the back of the wardrobe in the room that was now their room. She had unpacked it completely in March, the morning after the wedding, folding each thing and putting it where it belonged. And when it was empty, she had folded it too, and set it there, not thrown away, not hidden, but put away, the way you put away a thing that carried you somewhere, and that you do not need to carry anymore. On the shelf above the wardrobe there was a small cedar box that had been there when she arrived, which she had assumed was Mrs. Hennessy's and left untouched for months. In February, Cal had told her it had been his mother's, and that it held nothing much, some thread, a few buttons, a piece of ribbon. He said she could use it if she liked. She had moved her sewing things into it in March. The thread and buttons and ribbon were still there, underneath where she had left them. The ring she had tried to trade at the auction in October was in the cedar box too, in the corner, under a spool of brown thread. She had kept it, not because it meant anything it used to mean, but because it was hers, and because it was the thing she had been willing to trade for a start, and because there is something worth remembering about the moment you decided to keep going, even when keeping going cost you the last thing you had. She did not look at it often, but she knew it was there. Dora Fitch still ran the dry goods store. She still had opinions, which she still expressed in the form of questions. But she had not asked any questions about the Aldrich place since January. And when Vera came into the store on Saturdays, after the market, she said good morning in a tone that was not warm but was civil. And Vera said good morning back in the same tone, and they conducted their business. And that was that. Some things change the moment you look at them straight. June had a new coat by April, let out properly and with good seams, and Emmett had 2 shirts with intact elbows, and Cal had noticed both of these things and said nothing about either, which was how she knew he had noticed. On an evening in late April, with the light staying longer now and the fields beginning to green at the edges, Vera was on the porch with the mending when Cal came up from the barn and sat down on the step below her, the step that had been repaired in October and had been solid underfoot every morning since. He did not say anything. He looked out at the fields, at the light going over them, pulling the gold out of the grass before you were ready for it to leave. June came out and sat beside him on the step and leaned against his arm, and after a moment, Emmett came out too and sat on the porch rail and pretended to look at something in the middle distance. The evening settled around them. The goats were quiet in their pen. Somewhere in the pine brake to the east a bird was going through its last few notes of the day, unhurried, as if it had all the time there was. Vera set down the mending and looked at the fields and the light and the ridge to the north, where the sky was going, the soft colors of a day that had been good and was ending without complaint. The house behind her held its warmth, not waiting for anyone, not anymore. And that was the story of Vera and Cal Aldrich, a woman who arrived in Harlan Creek with a carpetbag and a ring she was willing to trade, and who found, before the second spring, that what she had traded into was the only thing that had ever truly been hers. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.